Hello, and welcome once again to the evil, oppressive, theocratic world domination conspiracy live stream. Today I am Ben McLean, and today I am joined by the Distributist.
Hello.
And we're here to discuss some recent developments in the open source community. Uh, Now, what's happened is that a few days ago, well, first let's talk about what is the open source community, right?
Mhm.
Um, open source code is the instructions that tell a computer what to do. So all of your different programs, programmers write the source code, which is uh, the description of what all those programs do and when and so on. And
Mhm.
so if you have the source code to a program, then you can change how it works. And writing source code is how you make programs, all right? Now, open source means that the source code is shared instead of being kept secret, uh, like some company keeps it secret so that only the program gets distributed but not the source code. Open source uh, promises and even demands uh, distributing the source code so that anyone who wants to can make changes to the programs.
And I should sort of maybe elaborate here as someone who's used Linux and has been at varying times in their life involved with these projects. This was really spearheaded, I think it was starting in the 80s when you had sort of corporatized software from.
70s, but close.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm thinking of the beginning of the GNU project with Richard Stallman, which I believe was the early 80s, but there are people doing this before, certainly.
Yeah,
Pardon me, and it took the form of several projects. When he said demands, Ben was absolutely right. There are a number of licenses that or projects that were started with different Creative Commons licenses. The first one is just the idea that you're going to publicize your source code. Lots of companies do this, but also there was a larger movement called GNU, or GNU's not Unix. Oh, they love using recursive acronyms, and this was This was a software project that promoted and demanded that if you made something that used the GNU code, it would also have to be open. So the idea was that this would be a sort of information is free alternative to corporatized software. And a lot of people thought that this was the future. And even though I don't think it ever took off to the extent people were hoping it would, it was a very distinctive alternative counterculture, an alternative software counterculture. And this also spawned things that were a little less open, like Linux, by Linus Torvalds, who was a founder who also was operating, I think, later in the 80s. And they became a force in the software development community writ large, going on and on until the 2000 and 2010s. I don't know if that's my perspective on it, I guess, or my
that's
brief
good.
summary.
I think it might be a good idea to explain the distinction between free software and open source,
Mhm.
because I think that will become important in discussions on this as we move forward. Now, open source has the definition that I gave it, that um, the source code's available. But free software, in the context of software development, we're not has a different meaning than freeware. Freeware means you get to use the program without spending money. But free software, those specific two words spelled out, means that there are rules that require that if you distribute the software, then you are required to share your source code and not just distribute the binaries, or in other words, the program you can run. You have to distribute the source code if you distribute the software at all, in order to guarantee that everyone else who gets it will be free to modify it any way they want. Now,
Oh, I'm well, so. can you, because I think that we're sort of treading on a very key distinction. Sometimes companies can't open the source code, and also, and it's still technically open source, but still they'll sue you if you make a product off of it and sell it. Essentially, they maintain some intellectual property rights despite the fact that the software is technically open and you could copy it, right?
Yeah. Now, the distinction here is that all free software is open source, but not all open source software is free software.
I'm okay. Well, okay. I guess and I also need to make another thing here too. Free software. We're not talking about like shareware, like we're giving it away for free. Like your Chrome browser is free software. Your Internet Explorer, I believe, is free software. There's lots of software that you can download, and it's not free software in the way that Ben means it. What he means is free software in the philosophical sense, sort of the difference between libertas and libra and gratis in Latin, right? Free
Right.
software is in free. It's not possessed by anyone, as opposed to free, we're giving it away, even though it's still, our services are still owned by the person giving them.
Yeah. Free gratis means you don't have to spend money in order to get it, while free libra means no one can stop you from getting it.
Yeah,
And
and
so
it's a distinction
free
because
soft and so
I believe they've.
free
Sorry, go ahead.
free software in the specific sense that we're talking about here means both together.
Well, yeah, Libris implies gratis, but gratis does not imply Libris.
Right. Now, the distinction between open source and free software, though, becomes important. Free software is open source with extra requirements.
Yes.
See, open source just means that you can get the source code, while free software means that you are required, if you redistribute the software, to do certain things, including distributing the source code.
And I believe, this gets really complicated really fast, Ben, because I believe there is a gradation of freeness in between, where, say, Stallman, Richard Stallman is the guy who invented GNU, the whole project of essentially an extensive open source share everything community, and where I think Linux ended up, because Linux was open source. You could take Linux and do whatever you wanted with it, but the Linux source code, Linux is an operating system that's an alternative to Windows. You could people and people did take Linux, rewrite it with slight modifications, and then sell it, like Red Hat, for instance, where you have corporate software written using Linux as a base, and you could not do that, from my understanding, with the hard GNU license. I believe hard GNU meant that if you used it and did the kind of modifications you did, it would be GNU itself. It was its own intellectual property that was essentially a corporation commanding freedom.
Something to that effect. What I'm trying to get here is to the distinction between the philosophy of Richard Stallman and that of Eric S. Raymond, the founder of the open source movement. You see, Stallman came out with this very strict definition of free software, which had all these requirements. You couldn't, for instance, under one of Stallman's licenses, you couldn't make a proprietary, you couldn't make a proprietary project like Red Hat using free software code in the sense meant by Stallman. And say, for instance, if I was like writing a game, for instance, I wouldn't be able to use Stallman's free software code in my proprietary game. I would have to redistribute the source code to my game also. So this was too restrictive for a lot of business purposes. And so in order to be more business friendly and more friendly to people who just want to share their code and are perfectly happy if their code ends up in commercial products that are proprietary. Uh, a more broad definition than free software was came up with, and this is open source. And the open source definition was simply that the public has to be able to get the source code. That's what open source means. The public can get the source code and can make their own modifications and can redistribute them. But it doesn't have the infectious requirement that everyone has to redistribute the source code to modified versions.
Now, I
And that
don't
makes
know. Sorry. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
that's in the open source definition. And that makes a huge difference. Things that are open source without being free software can often be much easier to work with as a result.
Now, I don't know exactly how you wanted to run this conversation. I would point out that sort of the jewel of open source software was always Linux. And
Yeah.
this spawned in itself a community around writing this stuff, which also focused around another program that Linus Torvalds, the person who turned Unix into Linux, wrote called Git, and the subsequent web community GitHub, which was essentially GitHub was a way that you could exchange software. And I think most of GitHub stuff was organized around open source, although I'm aware that you can close the source off of GitHub projects. But it was a community for software developers to share things. And I have some experiences with this community going back. And well, right around 2007 or so, GitHub, the community around open source, started getting really, as what we would say in the YouTube community, got really SJW. I don't know if you want to elaborate from there.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just quickly finish my previous point before moving on, though.
Okay,
And I
pardon me.
wanted to say that open source had to fight off the ideologues who absolutely wanted to insist on the requirement to only have their kind of license. But at the same time, open source had to defend itself against infiltration from Microsoft and other large companies, because what these companies were trying to do at the time was they were trying to make it so that they could claim that they are open source if if the tech people that you call on the phone when you support, for support, have access to the source, even if you don't have access to the source.
Yeah,
And
we're getting into more granular
Microsoft,
definitions, certainly.
Microsoft there was trying to fundamentally undermine what open source means. And so, in order to prevent that, Iric S. Raymond and the Open Source Initiative got a trademark on the term open source, which strictly defined it to mean what we understand it to mean today. It means that you can get the source code.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who uses, who advertises that their product is open source can get sued if they violate that trademark by violating that definition. You can't, if you can't actually get the source, then you're not open source. Now, the reason I open with this tidbit is because I'm pointing out that this isn't the first time that the open source community has dealt with infiltration efforts. Over the years, we've had various attempts to change what open source and other important terms mean in order to push various people's agendas. And I believe that's what we're starting to see right now. And so that's where
Perhaps
I'm.
you want
That's where
to,
I'm.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's where I'm trying to get us to. So the biggest and most important of the open source projects is probably the GNU Linux operating system, and the one of the most critical, if not the most critical part of it, is the Linux kernel. Now, the kernel of an operating system is the part that you might say is at the very heart of it, which it essentially tells all the other parts what to do. I think if I'm going to put what a kernel is in layman's terms, would you say that would be a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's sort of it's basically the operating system part of the operating system. The operating system's main function is to allow all of the different programs that are running on your system to cooperate over shared resources, namely disk space, memory, and processor time, or in modern days, disk space, memory, processor time, and graphical processor time. And the kernel does that. Everything else, strictly speaking, are bells and whistles that operate around it, including your graphical user interface and anything else that, say, for instance, manages your sound or anything. Like those are all drivers and interfaces and so on and so forth.
Okay. Now, Linux. Well, in the beginning, there was Unix.
Um,
Unix is a really old operating system.
Point of
Kernel.
order. Do you mind if you give me admin privileges on your chat? I was going to post some Wikipedia articles for your people who are watching in.
Sure, except I'm not sure how to do that.
If you go to the chat page, you can just make me an admin because I was just going to post some resources and links.
Basically, go to my own channel here.
Yeah.
And click on my own live stream, and then click on you to be an admin. Right? Okay, I will do that. Just one moment.
No hurry. Just wanted to point that out.
Clicking on you at moderator. Great, you're now a moderator.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so about in the beginning there was Unix. Unix was one of the most popular operating systems in the 70s, basically. And if I have got my timeline right, and people Unix was commercial though. People wanted a free and open source alternative to Unix, so that if things went wrong, they could actually fix them instead of going through the whatever company owned the original Unix, and so that they could make their own versions and not have to worry about restrictions on it. And so Linus Torvalds created an alternative to the Unix kernel called Linux, which stands for Linus's Unix. The Unix alternative created by Linus Torvalds. And so this gives us a piece of code called the Unix kernel, which put together with a set of tools by the GNU project of Richard Stallman gives us the GNU Linux operating system, which is one of the world's most popular operating systems apart from Windows, and is free. If you want to start using a GNU Linux-based operating system, I would recommend Ubuntu as a good starter. Now, the thing to understand, though, about the Linux kernel is that it isn't only in Linux computers. Android also uses the Linux kernel. So the Linux kernel is running on all of your Android devices. And many, many more devices that you use every day will often have the Linux kernel involved in them somehow. So it's not just, I'm starting up a Linux machine and I see the little penguin graphic and that means I'm running Linux. Well, actually, you may be using Linux without even knowing it, or using a Linux-based system without even knowing it. So it's important to understand that Linux is huge. And the popularity of Linux has made Linus Torvalds a very powerful man, at least in terms of trust, in terms of, computers around the world trust his code or trust the code that he authorizes. So in terms of open source developers, I would say that, at least until last week, Linus Torvalds was one of the most powerful developers in open source. Because essentially his word was law. He was the final arbiter of what did and did not make it into the Linux kernel, which means he got to
Is that?
decide.
But there weren't there. The Linux kernel had like lots of different versions of it.
Sure, but the main trunk of the Linux kernel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if it didn't go through Linus Torvalds, then it wasn't Linux. It might have been, Linux based, but Linux means maintained by Linus. Or at least until last week, Linux meant maintained by Linus. Now, that doesn't mean Linus wrote it all himself. Linus was a very much down in the trenches developer who reviewed lots of code and also uh, appointed the people who reviewed code for the Linux kernel, right? So if you wanted to get your code in the Linux kernel, you could submit a patch, and that patch, if you're lucky, would get looked at by one of the maintainers. And then the maintainers, if they liked your patch, they'd recommend it to Linus, and Linus would decide whether it got in or not. And
Mm-hmm.
that's essentially how the development of the Linux kernel went. And Linus's decisions for the past 30 years have strongly affected what code does and does not get to run on billions of computers around the world, or at least hundreds of millions. I don't know about billions, but at least hundreds and millions of computers around the world, including that Android phone you've got in your pocket. So, from that perspective, Linus is a very powerful man. That must be the distributists and the police. All right, so
Yeah,
now we
unfortunately,
know
it's yeah.
who the who we're talking about. All right, so last week on this gets us up to the present. Last week on the Linux kernel mailing list, Linus wrote a letter to the community, essentially, on the tail end of his weekly mailing list post, which is normally just technical information about what's going into the Linux kernel. And by the way, I don't read these. I'm not a heavy enough Linux user, and certainly even if I was, I'm nowhere near close enough to the kernel, for anything in there to be relevant to me. So I don't read it. It's not like I've never seen it though. I've seen it before, but I don't read
Yeah.
it.
Oh, I mean, if you have a copy of Linux, recompiling the kernel is something that you frequently do. You can modify the make file, and if you do read the kernel, Linus Torvalds has in the comments written little pearls of wisdom. It's kind of funny how personal it is sometimes, but you'll see it if you open up or at least a few 10 years ago when I read it, you could see him write little things in the kernel.
That's really cool. I've never done that. I haven't been a heavy enough Linux user to have done that. Personally, although I have used Linux for some things, and most of our audience has too. Whether you know you're using Linux or not is another question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyways, so last week on the mailing list, Linus wrote a letter to the community on the end of his post. And he said two things. The first of which I do not want to criticize at all. All right. The first thing he said, which is totally reasonable, he apologized to the community for bad behavior on his part over, the past few years, in which he said a number of.
Perhaps not the past few years. Linus has always has always been known and has always been a
Loose
self-admitted
cannon.
asshole.
Yeah, he's
Actually,
been
one of the
kind of a loose
reasons
cannon.
why he called GitHub Git was because he was naming it after himself. And he says, I'm a Git, which is another word for an asshole, right?
Yeah. I use Git at work every day, even though Linux is nowhere in sight. So,
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm using Linus's code too. Anyway, Linus, I don't remember how he phrased it exactly. I could bring it up, but I don't think that's the relevant thing to be reading here. He said he's going to take some time off from Linux kernel development and administration to work on personal issues that he has to try and deal with people better, essentially. And he apologizes for some of the offensive things he said over the years. And I want to say about that, that is totally reasonable. More power to him for that. And that was real mature to be able to admit that. So
Mhm.
there's no problem with Linus making that decision and acknowledging where he has been at fault in the past over this. But that wasn't the only thing he did. The other thing he did is something which I think is a mistake, and that is he announced that the Linux kernel developer community is adopting a new code of conduct. And this code of conduct has some serious, serious bugs that I think we definitely need to talk about. It is called the Contributor Covenant. And it's been adopted in the past several years by numerous prominent open source projects and some companies, including Google. And, well, it's bad, all right? It's really bad. This is total social justice is what this is. And so I'd kind
Mhm.
of like to dig into what's in this and talk about some of the problems with it. First, we might say a thing or two about the author. The author of it is Carolina or Coraline Auda Inc. That's EHMKE, which that is hard to pronounce. Inc. is what I'm going to say, unless you know of a better pronunciation. And this is a transgender person, which that's not really the problem, even though who knows, maybe it's connected. But the this person has a history of trying to co-opt open source projects for political reasons. Uh,
Mhm.
one, one thing they did was on the Opal project. They opened on GitHub. They opened issue 941. And what issue 941 is, it was essentially Carolyn Ada Inc. complaining that one of the lead developers on the Opal project is, quote, transphobic, unquote. And linked to their saying on their own personal Twitter account publicly, completely apart from the project, that I think it was something to the effect that transgender is probably a mental disorder or something to that effect, which I think it is a mental disorder myself. Well, it's a mental disorder plus a political ideology, but that's beside the point, because even if you disagree with that point of view, still people need to be able to express their own personal political, religious, and philosophical opinions outside of open source projects without having their ability to contribute to open source projects threatened
I
for
should
their
point out
political
here that
beliefs.
this has been a long time coming, especially in the GitHub community. The GitHub community has been moving in this direction for a very long time.
Right. Well, fortunately, at least as far as I know, Opal basically just laughed in her face, and good for them. But this does show that Inc. has certain extreme leftist opinions. And I think that what this person has written needs to be interpreted given that context. In order to understand what is meant by a lot of the things in the new Linux kernel community code of conduct, I think we need to understand that this is coming from the person who did that, and as far as I know, is unapologetic about it. This person does want to purge people from open source projects for having the wrong political opinions, and is very open about that being that person's agenda. And they are also anti-meritocratic, which, I mean, they're explicitly anti-meritocratic in what we're going to look at. So I'd
Well,
like
but
to...
again, there were, I maybe we mentioned this, I missed it. GitHub had released a very similar ethics guideline where they said all this stuff about transphobia and how they would never entertain claims of reverse racism, whatever the hell that means. But basically, they'll never entertain claims of racism coming from white people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was like 4 years ago, right? And
Yeah.
at that point, I saw that and I'm like, oh, I know exactly where this is going. And I guess we finally got there. But, I think this, I would like to voice my opinion that I thought this was more or less expected on my end.
Yeah. Now, it is important to recognize that, this person, Inc., worked for GitHub. And this is the same person who was behind that effort at GitHub. So this is the exact same person. So let's not, those two things aren't just connected, they're the same person. So but it's also important to recognize that there isn't, as far as I know, a direct connection between Inc. and Linus or the maintainers of the Linux kernel. So the Linux kernel maintainers, by adopting this code of conduct, all they may have done is just copied what a whole bunch of other prominent open source projects have already done, including Eclipse, Ruby, the .NET Foundation, Mozilla, JRuby, Angular. A whole bunch of prominent open source projects have already adopted this. So I'd like to look at the actual text of some of this.
Sure.
I'm going to share my screen for that. Now, just give me a moment here. Screen sharing. Here we go. Can you see my screen now? Oh, I have to hit another button of share.
I can.
Share. Great. All right. Now, I hope that everyone can see it now.
I can see it.
Great. I'd appreciate it if you'd monitor the chat, Distributus, and let me know if anyone says that they can't see it or something like that. All right, so we're going to look at what they have to say here. Now, this isn't the code of conduct itself. This is a page that describes what the code of conduct does. And we'll look at the actual code of conduct in a minute. Here we have a code of conduct for open source projects. Open source has always been a foundation of the internet, and with the advent of social open source networks, this is more true than ever. But free, Libra, and open source projects suffer from a startling lack of diversity, which is false, with dramatically low representation by women, false, people of color, false, and other marginalized populations, false. Part of this problem lies with the very structure of some projects. The use of insensitive language, thoughtless use of pronouns, assumptions of gender, and even sexualized or culturally insensitive names. Marginalized people also suffer some of the unintended consequences of dogmatic insistence on meritocratic principles of governance. In other words, marginalized people suffer when you require that your code be good or your code doesn't get in the project. Stopping the suffering of marginalized people, according to this sentence, is more important than code quality. This is what happens when SJWs get a hold of any organization. It stops being about producing whatever good thing it was meant to produce and becomes about spreading their particular brand of hate. That's that. I mean, so this right here, this is a really damning problem with what the Linux kernel community is doing here. Anyway, studies have shown that organizational cultures that value meritocracy often result in greater inequality. Let's assume that's true. Why should we care? People with, quote, merit, unquote, are often excused for their bad behavior in public spaces based on the value of their technical contributions. Now that's Linus Torvalds. Okay, I have to admit, that's true. Now they shouldn't put merit in scare quotes because we're talking about actual merit here, not fake merit. We're talking about actual technical merit, which doesn't care about your politics or even about being nice. So people with real merit are often excused for their bad behavior in public spaces based on the value of their technical contributions, and that can be a real problem because actual bad behavior can be a real problem. So I'm not going to deny that that sentence is this is the kernel of truth. Remember in my video on Trump's lies, I said that every lie depends on there being some truth in it in order for the lie to get its power to deceive. Now, this is the truth. This sentence that I've highlighted, this is the truth inside the lie. This is the truth which the rest of the lie is using in order to persuade. You see what I'm saying? You still
Sorry, I
there?
was on mute. Yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
I muted myself. Yes, I do see.
All right. Well, anyways, I guess if you don't have any comments on that, I can just keep
Well,
going. Oh.
I mean, this is sort of I mean, I think I've sort of been fundamentally skeptical of like this meritocracy concept. So, I mean, I guess maybe I'm radically agreeing with this, but ethics does need to play a part in any kind of contributor community. The issue is really, I think, the fact that a particular type of person is writing the ethical code who I would say probably does not embody what most people think. And even if they did embody what most people think, I would just consider it to be flat out objectively wrong.
Right. Well, we really ought to do a better job of defining meritocracy here. Now, I'm assuming meritocracy means that people who write or meritocracy means that code quality and only code quality should decide what code gets in the project and what code doesn't. That's what I'm assuming meritocracy to mean in the context of open source. Now, if they're going off some other definition of meritocracy, then I think they're just being manipulative. But maybe they'll clear this up later on. Let me keep going, and maybe they'll clear it up. Of course, clearing things up isn't exactly what SJWs do. Anyway, they say meritocracy also naively assumes a level playing field in which everyone has access to the same resources, free time, and common life experiences to draw on. Now, I might say, no, it doesn't. Meritocracy just doesn't care. It doesn't care whether there's a
I,
level playing field,
I think what they
whether
mean is they
anyone has
mean
access to the same resources. What?
it's kind of obvious here what they mean is some kind of egalitarian notion or equal opportunity. That's what they're talking about. What they meant to say is equal opportunity implies this, which is why I don't like the word equal opportunity.
I'm not. Well, I mean, if I'm looking at an open source project, I mean, I should. I. It seems to me that code quality should be the only thing that matters, and it doesn't matter how good of a programmer you could be if your life circumstances haven't led you to the position of being that good of a programmer, then you're not that good of a programmer, period. And it's not the role of open source projects to correct for that.
I understand the idea, but this is the difficulty with using equal opportunity language and using it interchangeably with meritocracy, because I can see the cultural confusion they're getting involved in, right?
What you're saying is that they're assuming this means equal opportunity. So it ought
Yes.
to read, they would better express their idea that equal opportunity as a goal also naively assumes a level playing field in which everyone has access to the same resources, free time, and common life experiences to draw upon.
Yeah, that's what they mean.
Even this still seems to be fundamentally something that is well outside the purview of most open source projects. Most open source projects shouldn't care about any of that. They should only care about doing what their program is supposed to do and doing it well, and that's all. Who writes the code shouldn't matter.
Well, but that's not equal opportunity. That's simply functionality,
Right.
right? And
Right. So I'm not
this is
even
where
a
we get into the difficulty with these terms. Meritocracy has been interchanged with equal opportunity, which has been interchanged with, well, the idea that the circumstances need to in some sense be leveled, and that's where you encounter all these problems.
right. Well, okay. Well, anyways, these factors and more make contributing to open source a daunting prospect for many people, especially women and other underrepresented people. Why should we care?
Well, because we've been told that equal opportunity is a thing that people need to strive for.
Oh,
I've actually gone to a lot of these developer meetups,
yeah.
and I never will never forget this. I had a friend who's an open source developer. He kind of ran his own little company, and he got berated by a woman who just started using Linux like a month ago because he wasn't doing enough to ensure diversity and equal opportunity inside his company, which was not making money. And she just berated him because he had an all white development staff. She knew nothing about software development. She knew nothing about what it took. All she knew is that this was what people had promised, and that's what she was going to do.
Yikes. I mean, that's absolutely crazy.
Well, no,
Uh,
it's expected based on how we set up the ethical system that we're
right.
operating under.
So, I mean, now it might be worth looking at the critical analysis of meritocracy that they link to. I mean, I might say I would encourage anyone watching this who is at all curious about these issues to look into the sources behind all of this, the contributor covenant and its description. I might not have time on stream to go into all of them, but I might say that they do have links that will go into more detail on the concepts, at least some of them. The I didn't I didn't I mentioned about the underrepresentation and so forth, that's false. They don't cite any sources, therefore I don't have to believe them on any of that. Uh, Even if it's true that there is a statistically smaller percentage of these groups in open source than in the general population, still, whether that is underrepresentation, or in other words, a representation that is too low, assumes that the representation in open source should match that in the general society. And I see no reason why we should assume that. So even if they did cite statistics, the statistics still wouldn't answer the philosophical question of why we should assume that the makeup of open source projects should match the general society. I don't see any reason why we should assume that it should.
Well, you would assume that it. Well, I mean, I don't know how to say this. I mean, you would assume you're not talking about anything having to do with the open source. You're talking about the entire philosophy we've taken to racial equality in the last 50 years.
Oh yeah,
The idea we've taken to racial equality or racial and gender equality in the last 50 years
and every
is that
other marginalized population.
if there
Sorry.
is not if there is not a reason to believe that the that if there's not a reason to believe that there's not a prima facie reason for why there's inequality, we assume that the inequality is malevolent and due to bigotry and hatred and needs to be immediately stamped out. That's been the operating assumption
Yeah.
since the
That's
60s.
and that's the assumption that, even if they cited statistics to show that these populations were relatively smaller in open source than in the general population, that assumption that that a good representation is an equal representation, and
Well,
that
no, but
any
it just
unequal
begs the
representation,
question. It begs the question going back, right?
and that any
Why they're less
representation
represented?
must be bad. That is something I think they would have a real hard time proving if it was questioned at all. And the only way that they deal with that, with questioning that, by the way, is to call you a racist or sexist or whatever, and deplatform you or whatever. They don't deal with that assumption. As far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't be at all surprised if whites and Asians were more prominent in open source than others, just because a lot of them happen to have a strong interest in this stuff. Also, a lot of them happen to have autism. Anyway,
Well, okay, but we know that this is the philosophy that
yeah,
the mainstream takes to everything, right? So
right.
we should not be surprised.
Okay. So here we go. To keep going with their description of their thing. A small step forward. An easy way to begin addressing the problem is to be overt in our openness, welcoming all people to contribute and pledging in return to value them as human beings and foster an atmosphere of kindness, cooperation, and understanding. Now, I think this here is something the open source community has always done. The open source community has always been overt in their openness, hence the name open source, and has always been very overt about welcoming all people to contribute. No one cares or even wants to know what your actually I want to quote something. I have a good quote. This quote is from the Stephen Levy's 1984 book Hackers. One of the items that describes the hacker culture is hacker ethic point 4. Hackers should be judged by their hacking, not by bogus criteria such as degrees, age, race, or position. And that has always been understood to include gender and anything the hell else. And that has always been the case in, well, we say the hacker community, but, people who have this sort of open source mindset have always had that as part of their ethic. So that wouldn't be anything new. That wouldn't be a change. What would be a change, perhaps, might be this pledging in return to value them as human beings and to foster an atmosphere of kindness, cooperation, and understanding. Now, you could argue that a lot of open source projects and mailing lists and so on for decades maybe have been a little bit lacking in this area. So this part's reasonable. The contributor covenant can be one way to express these values. Pledge your respect and appreciation for contributors and participants of your open source project by adding an explicit code of conduct.md to your project repository. And let's look at the English version here. So here's the actual code of conduct. Our pledge. In the interests of fostering an open and welcoming environment, we as contributors and maintainers pledge to making participation in our project and our community a harassment-free experience for everyone. regardless of age, body size, disability, ethnicity, sex characteristics, gender identity and expression, level of experience, education, socio and economic status, nationality, personal appearance, race, religion, or attack helicopter status, and orientation. Oh, I mean, sexual identity and orientation.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Pretty standard.
yeah. That we might say though that well, we already have this problem with this undefined term harassment, and that's going to come up throughout this. That the term harassment is never defined, and that's a serious problem with this whole document. But that I don't see the need for a code of conduct like this because in the world of open source, no one cares about any of this, and no one ever has. People care about the quality of your code and whether you're asking good questions or bad questions. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
And the refusal to acknowledge this fact that I just stated about the open source community and its history is another serious problem behind all of this. Anyway, so let's keep going then.
Yeah, I guess I'm always asking the question, like, was that ever a thing? Are we saying what we wanted to be true or was actually true?
Exactly. I think that this ink person, I'm not sure which gender to refer to them as. I think that this ink person desperately wants the history of the open source community to be a history of oppression because they believe, like all good communists, that the history of every hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That is the fundamental belief of all of these kinds of people on the far left. That the past has to always be understood exclusively in terms of oppression. And
but
so,
were we ever this like completely blind meritocracy? I'm skeptical of that as well.
I think that the open source community has a really good record on that, on being a blind meritocracy, much better than really anything else in the world. If there ever has been a blind meritocracy, I've got to say it's probably the open, because not only is there no racial, ethnic, religious, or other prejudice, but also most of the people don't even know any of these categories, how any of the other contributors fit into any of these categories. Most people have no idea. In fact, it's normal for people to just use the male pronoun all the time, because there's a lot more men than women, which I don't see as a problem. But if more women want to participate, that's awesome. But I don't see it as a problem that more men are participating. It's normal to use male pronouns only because no one cares. I mean, no one cares. That's it is a virtue by omission. You know, um, now I'm sure if somebody came on calling themselves Hitler Nazi 666 on the mailing list, yeah, that people might have a problem with that, or other controversial usernames or whatever. People are going to have a problem with that, or jihad kill Jews or whatever.
I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, so what we're asking for an ethic. We just don't like this current one.
I'm saying the open source community has already done a great job on all of this for the most part.
Well, I
Without
don't
needing
know.
this. Oh, really?
Well, I mean, I guess when we say it's done a great job, it means they've taken our preferred ethic to essentially be the guidelines, and now we don't like the fact that they're moving it.
Oh,
or something closer to our preferred ethic.
I suppose. But what I mean is, I would agree that kicking someone out of an open source project or attacking them or whatever based on any of this stuff, uh, at least attacking them in the project, would be out of line. And really, I don't think has been tolerated where it has occurred. Um, so I don't think that there is any kind of rampant problem with discrimination on any of these bases in the open source community, nor has there been in the past 30 years. So,
Well, I guess I am quibbling, but I largely agree with you that
yeah,
I thought that this wasn't a problem.
right. Now,
But
Linus shooting his mouth off on the mailing list was a problem. That was a problem. But it wasn't a big enough problem to justify some of what they're doing here, which we're going to get into as we keep going down here. Let's keep going, I'd say. Our standards. Examples of behavior that contributes to creating a positive environment include using welcoming and inclusive language, being respectful of differing viewpoints and experiences. This is standpoint theory here. They don't mean different political opinions. They mean
yeah, I
standpoint
mean,
theory.
everyone who's dealt with SJWs knows what's coming next.
Right.
It's just the standard boilerplate.
Gracefully accepting constructive criticism, focusing on what is best for the community, showing empathy towards other community members as long as they're not conservatives. Examples of unacceptable behavior by participants include the use of sexualized language or imagery and unwelcome sexual attention or advances. If they just said porn, then I'd agree. Porn's bad, keep it out of these projects. But sexualized language, that can mean a lot of different things. So I'm a little skeptical of what's meant by that. Anyway, trolling, insulting / derogatory comments, and personal or political attacks, which is very much open to being interpreted in a very one-sided way. Public or private harassment. Publishing others' private information, such as a physical or electronic address, without explicit permission. Other conduct which could reasonably be considered inappropriate in a professional setting. And, a lot of this is, genuinely bad stuff that we don't want in open source projects. So I don't know if they need an actual policy to stop a lot of this in open source projects, but if they had one, having a lot of this in there would obviously be a thing to be in there. So I'm not going to complain about this too much, except a few of these things do raise some red flags. Now, our responsibilities. Project maintainers are responsible for clarifying the standards of acceptable behavior and are expected to take appropriate and fair corrective action in response to any instances of unacceptable behavior. Project maintainers have the right and responsibility to remove, edit, or reject comments, commits, code, wiki edits, issues, and other contributions that are not aligned to this code of conduct, or to ban temporarily or permanently any contributor for other behavior that they deem inappropriate for other behaviors that they deem inappropriate, threatening, offensive, or harmful. In other words, it's just sort of a blanket go nuts and do whatever you want if you're a moderator.
In an hour, that's why.
Just to let you know, before we go through the entire thing, I have
Yeah.
to leave in like half an hour or so. So,
All right. Well, we're 2/3 through this page, and this is the only this would be we're close to the end of this part here. So now scope. This code of conduct applies both within project spaces and in public spaces when an individual is representing the project or its community. Examples of representing a project or community include using an official project email address, posting via an official social media account, or acting as an appointed representative at an online or offline event. Representation of a project may be further defined and clarified by project maintainers, which is another go nuts and doesn't. None of the rest of this limits what counts as representing the project. And we know from Inc.'s history that they think that talking about politics on your own personal Twitter account counts as representing the project.
Yeah, we've known the SJWs believe this, and indeed they are the ones in control of this community and have been for 10 years now.
Okay, so enforcement. Now here's the more kind of scary part. Instances of abusive, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior may be reported by contacting the project team at insert email address here. All complaints will be reviewed and investigated and will result in a response that is deemed necessary and appropriate to the circumstances. The project team is obliged to maintain confidentiality with regard to the reporter of an incident. Further details of specific enforcement policies may be posted separately. Now, this sentence I'm highlighting, the project team is obligated to maintain confidentiality with regard to the reporter of an incident. This encourages lying. And the way that this encourages lying is by promising that someone's identity will be kept anonymous, even in the case that they are not telling the truth. So if you intentionally lie, you can still hide behind anonymity. That encourages people to lie because they know that there is no risk for lying. So if they're mad at any of the maintainers for any reason, they can make something up and there will be no consequence. And that's a serious problem. I believe that if you are going to try to ruin someone else's reputation, which is what this can do. I mean, if someone gets suspended from an open source project for sexual harassment or whatever, there's a good chance they could also get suspended from their job or even fired. There is a good chance of that.
And so, the writers of this know this for sure.
Yeah. So the decision made by the maintainers here, this isn't just, oh, you got kicked out of working on your Wolfenstein 3D fork, big deal. No, this can get you fired from your job. And your employer can use the decision made by the open source project as a source to justify firing you. So this is a really dangerous thing. So if you are going to put someone else's reputation at risk with your accusation, your reputation needs to be on the line in case you're lying. You should absolutely not be able to make accusations like this anonymously. It ought to say, in my view, that if you are caught lying, the fact that you lied about this will be made public. Because if they don't do that, then they are encouraging lying. That's my view on this. Now, maybe that gets a little more controversial than some of my other objections.
I don't know. I mean, I think that they're essentially just playing from the standard corporate America playbook.
There are, though, corporations, though, they do have certain corporations do have certain regulations on them from the government which protect employees that open source projects don't have. And so in a corporation, yeah, the accuser can be anonymous.
But if you're wondering where that accuser is anonymous thing is, that comes from corporate HR departments.
Yeah. But if you sue the company is going to have all the information about that on record, and you can't see it in discovery, I believe. Isn't that true?
Well, if it comes to a lawsuit, then they'll have to disclose a number of things if you sue them.
Right. But most of these open source projects can't be sued. They're not corporations. You can't get standing to sue them. So this,
Yeah, I understand, but I mean that's a function of the fact that they're not corporations, not over the fact that they're employing a standard that's weird. What they're doing is they're saying that, like, okay, look, we want to have the same standards as the corporations do, but we just don't want to play by their rules because we're not making money on this shit. And that is, I don't know, is it fair? I don't know. I mean, it's something that we certainly see a lot of when it comes to um when it comes there. I mean, I don't know really how to say whether it's fair or not. I mean, I guess you can see it's not a mystery to me why this message got into power. This is essentially the message I would expect. They copy essentially what amounted to a corporate policy with some additional exemptions in the fact that they don't have to actually act like a corporation. To me, that's totally, I don't want to say it's innocuous. It's not innocuous. But what it is expected. I'm not surprised they're doing this.
Well, I'm not surprised by any of this either, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't point out the problems, especially for people who, many of whom don't, they don't think about this stuff, and so they might not immediately see the problems. So that's why I'm going out of my way to point out all the problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem starts in corporate HR. What we're seeing is the tail end effect.
Oh, sure. I mean, this has been a long time in the egg, and I'm not saying. I mean, Linux is just the most recent open source project to adopt this. I mean, this has been adopted all over the place. Anyways, just getting to the end here, just like these last couple sentences left. Further details of specific enforcement policies may be posted separately. Project maintainers who do not follow or enforce the code of conduct in good faith may face temporary or permanent repercussions as determined by other members of the project's leadership. Okay, and it's based on the contributor covenant, and it's by Inc., who we know that Inc. thinks that based on yes, this developer is publicly calling trans people out for, quote, not accepting reality, unquote, on Twitter. Trans people aren't accepting reality. He's right. His Twitter profile mentions that he is a core contributor to Opal. Is this what the other maintainers want to be reflected in the project? Will any transgender developers feel comfortable contributing? And so I think this really shows what Inc. is. This shows Inc.'s true colors. This isn't about actual harassment of specific people. This is about expressing political opinions that Inc. disagrees with. And what gets to count as a political attack and what doesn't is going to be interpreted based on this kind of expectation that if someone disagrees with the ideology of transgenderism, then they should get suspended from the project they're working and possibly even fired from their job. So, yeah, we should absolutely not be trusting this person to write or maintain the code of conduct for important open source and corporate code of conduct policies. I mean, we should absolutely not be trusting this kind of person with that. This is the same person, by the way.
No, I understand. I guess, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what leverage do we have against these people at this stage?
Oh, right. Well, I might talk about. Well, I don't know if we have. I mean, how much time we got left?
Well, I'm hoping to get dinner, so I'm perhaps wrapping it up in 20 minutes. I mean,
Sure,
we've been at it for an hour and a half at this stage, almost an hour and a half. So
I'm going to stop sharing my screen here because I think we're done looking at stuff on the screen. Now, an important thing to understand about open source is that the nature of open source and especially free software is that anyone can take the code and start maintaining it themselves and making any changes they want and can have their own version. And so, what happens if your project gets hijacked by SJWs? Well, you can always fork it. You can always start another version of it. And if you can convince the community or large parts of the community to follow your fork instead of following the main fork, then you'll have gotten the project back, essentially. Let's say I think that Linus has made a mistake here in trusting this code of conduct and the author of it, especially. But yeah, the code of conduct, based on some of the stuff it says, the problem with not really defining harassment, um, and the problem with anonymous complaints, and how that's going to function differently in an open source environment than it is in corporations. Um, those are serious bugs with this code of conduct. Even if we ignore who the author is, those are serious bugs.
I think they're not bugs; they're intentional. Like it's not like they set out to make a politically neutral document and
like DRM. They're intentional bugs.
Okay, that's a different definition than I usually say when I say bug, but these are absolutely intentional.
These are malicious. Malicious code. These are like malware.
Yeah, the question is how much of the community actually agrees with people like us that this is not the way to run a community.
Yeah. Now, the good news is you can fork most of these projects if they get too egregious. If they have, say, massive political purges of developers based on their politics, then there can be forks. And say if Linus, grew devil horns, I think Linus has made a mistake here, and I think that he can fix it pretty easily. It's not really that big of a mistake. It's pretty easy to fix. Just modify the code of conduct to address some of these concerns, or get rid of the code of conduct. There's that too. But let's say Linus grew devil horns and decided to go on a program of purging any developer who doesn't completely agree with Karl Marx about everything. All right. Well, the developers who got purged can very easily fork the project, which means they get to have their own version that last, and they can just start maintaining it themselves, and they don't need permission from Linus or anyone else to do that. And that's part of the nature of open source and part of what and free software, and part of what makes it great. For instance, a famous fork that recently happened was that there was a lot of disagreement over certain decisions in the direction of open office. So a fork of open office was created by the dissidents called LibreOffice. And now there's both open office and LibreOffice, which are two different forks when you can choose which one you want to go with, depending on which direction you wanted to see it.
And this has always been the case, but somehow when this has been the case, these SJW types have gotten to the top of the biggest stack of developers and have crowned themselves kings. So
they are.
The existence of like freedom to move has not stopped them the first time we've run the open source project idea. So I'm not so sure that I think that's going to stop them a second time.
Sure, but it is a possibility. One thing, remember when I said that Linus Torvalds is one of the most powerful developers in open source?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's important to understand that the source of his power is, and I'm not saying this power is a bad thing, by the way. It's generally been a good thing. The source of his power is the willingness of Linux distro maintainers to follow the changes he authorizes in the Linux kernel, when they could decide to switch to anybody else's kernel anytime they like. They'd have to stop calling it Linux, but they could do that. It wouldn't be that big a deal. So, say some guy named Fred decides Linus Torvalds is a Git. I'm going to make my own version instead. He could start his own version called Fredrix, which would be the Unix alternative maintained by Fred. And that can happen anytime. The trick is getting the getting the people downstream from that, which in the case of the Linux kernel would be the distro maintainers, to follow the fork instead of the original team or whoever controls the account of the original, the original project. And that is extremely hard to do, especially since people have to do actual work to change which fork they're getting changes from, you know. So the SJWs would have to mess up really bad, and these purges would have to be really large and make a lot of people really mad before anyone decides that they are fed up enough with Linus to leave Linux. And a lot of these other projects are the same way in varying degrees. So it's a very much an uphill battle to unseat a lot of these people. But the good news is there is a very, very, very clear way to do it. It's decentralized, and it can happen anytime, and it doesn't need any of these people's permission or even involvement to happen. So that's the good news. Now, I don't think that forking Linux at this point is a good solution or even something I would advise at this point, because we haven't seen any purges happen. If they happen, we may at some point in the future have to look at forking Linux or something to that effect. But at this point, forking Linux or trying to get distros to follow a fork instead of following Linux would be premature, because even though it says some things on paper that are very worrying, we haven't seen actual massive abuses happening in the Linux community yet. But it can happen, and we've seen it start happening in big tech. So it is something to be aware of and concerned about.
Make a good point.
All right. Now, there's a number of other things I'd like to talk about, but you're about out of time. But I thought it would be worth looking over all this and talking about it. I might mention real briefly that I'm using Linux myself. I'm trying to start to at least dip my toe in to get involved in a project called ZeroNet. Have you heard of ZeroNet?
I have, but I'm not as familiar with it as you are.
Well, ZeroNet is an attempt to have websites similar to Facebook and Twitter and Reddit without depending on a single central server, but instead maintained on a peer-to-peer basis, which means that you don't have to go through Zach Zucker. You don't have to go through Zuckerberg or Dorsey or whoever's in charge of Google now in order to be able to talk back and forth about politics or whatever. If people like your site, they will help host it. And if they don't, then they won't. And cryptography, the same cryptography that makes Bitcoin work, is used to maintain the security so that your account stays yours. You get a private key similar to a Bitcoin wallet, which makes sure that you'd be the only one who can authorize changes to your site. So if you wanted to ban someone, you can. But you can on your site. And so basically, it's almost like everyone doesn't just get their own Twitter account. It's more like everyone gets their own Twitter, which can connect or disconnect from anyone else's Twitter on a more or less ad hoc basis. And I think it's a really great strategy for taking on big tech and the censorship of political thought online. It's essentially doing for ongoing discussions, especially of politics, what Napster and Torrent did for music. It's just sort of music distribution. I mean, it's going around the big corporations and just letting people meet and share directly with other people. And I find that really exciting. So I'd like to see more of that going on in the future. And it isn't just completely separated from the regular internet, because you can make a proxy site so that things you're doing on there can be as visible as you want to the open internet also. So this really makes you uncensorable. As long as you have fans who are going to keep hosting or helping to host, as long as you have at least one fan out there, then you can't be censored. And that's what's really exciting about
I think
zero.
that's the real opportunity for the future of open source. But with that, I think I am running short on time, so I might have to duck out right now. Maybe we can do another live stream. You said you wanted to talk about nerd culture and the stuff. Well, maybe we could set that up later.
Yeah, some other time. Thank you so much for coming on, Distributist.
Oh, no, it was great. I really enjoyed talking about it.
And I appreciated your comments, and you helped me keep on track, which is great.
All right.
And hopefully we can do this again sometime soon. Well,
Of course, anytime, Ben. Have a good night.
all right. Thanks very much.